What's going on, gang? On today's episode of The Downfall of Democracy, we're going to talk about something called TrumpDerangementSyndrome, which I think I can self-diagnose myself with, but just to be sure, let's find out. Let's just make sure. If you didn't know, Trump derangement syndrome is a pejorative term used to describe criticism of or negative reactions to President Donald Trump that are perceived to be irrational and have little regard for Trump's actual policy positions. Why am I talking about this today? Well, it has everything to do with a bill that Republicans tried to pass in Minnesota. It's actually a revision to a current bill, which would amend Minnesota Statutes 2024, sections 245.462, subdivision 20, by adding a subdivision which appears to define Trump derangement syndrome, which they define as the acute onset of a paranoia in otherwise normal persons that is in reaction to the policies and presidencies of the President Donald J. Trump. Symptoms may include Trump-induced general hysteria, which produces an inability to distinguish between legitimate policy differences and signs of psychic pathology in President Donald J. Trump's behavior. This may be expressed by verbal expressions of intense hostility towards President Donald J. Trump and overt acts of aggression and violence against anyone supporting President Donald J. Trump or anything that symbolizes President Donald J. Trump. In other words, Minnesota Republicans are trying to classify speaking out against their supreme ruler as a mental illness. This is a problem for a couple different reasons. For starts, this is not in the DSM-5. All right, you're not going to find that in the mental health handbook that lists all of the problems that you can be medically diagnosed with in your brain. Not a legitimate medical thing. This is just a bill that Minnesota Republicans were going to try to pass into law. And that is very dangerous because it bridges on impacting your First Amendment freedoms. At what point is criticism of the Trump administration going to land you with the label mentally ill? I've seen how this administration defines disrespectful. I can only imagine what they would define as hostile. Because I think we all know that it's basic criticism towards how they do things. I don't agree with really anything Trump does, from himself to his policies. However, is someone who criticizes the amount of times Donald Trump plays golf on the weekends going to be slapped with the label mentally ill? And this isn't just about the stigma that comes with the label being mentally ill. There are all sorts of consequences that could potentially stem from a diagnosis like that. I know at least in Pennsylvania, you could potentially be a hop, skip, jump away from arrest. We've got something here called a 302, which is a detainment if someone determines that you are mentally unwell and pose a threat to yourself or others. And you can go right down the line with that. In a world where that passes, what is stopping someone who doesn't like the things that I say, my criticism towards the president, what is stopping them from calling the police and having me detained? All because I didn't like the fact that the president's wasting our taxpayer dollars on golf. The nerve to introduce a bill like that in Minnesota. Wrapping my head around why you would introduce that just blows my mind. To try declaring people mentally ill for speaking out against tyranny is nuts. You see, the problem doesn't lay with the people calling out the Trump administration for their wrongdoings. The problem is with the people who support the Trump administration and their wrongdoings. The problem is with the people who prop up these lies that the Trump administration tells. The problem is with people who are trying to pass these bills in states that limit your freedom of speech for speaking out against tyranny. To put the cherry on top of all of that, you just have to point to what happened right after this bill was introduced. It turns out that Republican State Senator Justin Ecorn, it doesn't really matter. He was caught trying to solicit a minor for prostitution. This is a bad guy. I don't know how to drive my point home. This is a pedo who's trying to pass a bill limiting your free speech. Don't throw your hat in the ring with these people. I don't know how to make it any clearer. I don't know how people don't see the clear division between right and wrong at this point. It's because MAGA is a cult. Donald Trump is the head of a cult. How do people not see this? How do we not see the bad? It's slapping us right in the face. Senator Glenn Gruenhagen, one of the senators who introduced this bill, said on Facebook defending the legislation, on the matter of TDS, people of different political persuasions can differ when discussing issues. We should be able to have civil debates without demonstrating violent and unreasonable reactions, such as burning down Tesla dealerships, threatening people who wear Trump hats, or committing road rage at the sight of a Trump bumper sticker on a person's car. This irrational behavior is unacceptable in a civil society. It suggests a deeper psychological problem. That is what this bill addresses, not mere political disagreements. And of course, we all know that the Democrats and Governor Walz will never allow this bill to pass anyway, so take a deep breath and calm down. So what you're telling me is you put forth this legislation knowing that it wasn't going to pass. Is this a joke? Senator Glenn Gruenhagen, did you get paid to author this legislation? Did you knowingly waste Minnesota taxpayer dollars authoring a bill or changing one, amending one, whatever the heck you decided you were going to do, knowing that there was no chance in hell that it would pass? It sounds to me like you're wasting some taxpayer money right there. Can you see the hypocrisy here? For a party that is so hell-bent on saving the American taxpayers' money, the Republicans are awful good at wasteful spending in their own right. When I talk about Donald Trump golfing, it's not a joke. He's been in office, 8 weeks since inauguration? The 8 weekends he's had since inauguration, he's golfed 6 of them in Florida, and he's been to Florida on 7 of them. It cost the American taxpayers millions of dollars to get his old ass to and from Florida safely. You'd think he'd find a golf course in Washington, D.C., but no. The reason for that is because he makes money every time he goes to Florida to golf and stay there, because he's spending that money at his resorts. He upcharges the Secret Service to stay at his hotels. He golfs at his resorts. He eats at his resorts. He's pocketing our taxpayer money. And that's the big fish. We have smaller state governments like Minnesota who are passing meme bills. I don't even know what you call this particular bill. I don't get it. You spent money putting that together. And it doesn't benefit your constituents. What is the benefit to classifying TDS as a mental illness? What is it? I can't see any benefit to your constituents. It's a waste of time and taxpayer resources, but hey, you do you. And that's where my point that I just outlined comes in. This is a perfect way to silence the people who are speaking out against your cause. You can have them declared mentally ill, and from there you can lock them up or detain them in some way. At some point with a mental illness designation, you could restrict their access to firearms, which means the people who oppose you are less likely to stand up and fight for their rights. Just to be sure, I looked into the laws in Minnesota in regards to the mentally ill and firearms possession. And sure enough, ding ding ding, mentally ill people are restricted from owning firearms in the state of Minnesota. The law in Minnesota says a person who is or has ever been committed in Minnesota or elsewhere by a judicial determination that the person is mentally ill, developmentally disabled, or mentally ill and dangerous to the public, as defined in section 253B.02, to a treatment facility, or who has ever been found incompetent to stand trial or not guilty by reason of mental illness, and blah 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 blah. Really, all they would need to do in Minnesota is commit you to a treatment facility. So that's an example of how Minnesota would do it. Do you see how this is pro-authoritarian? You say something anti-Trump, they declare you mentally ill, they check you into a treatment facility, which restricts your access to firearms. And when push comes to shove, all of this makes it harder to stand up to an authoritarian regime. The blueprint is right here in Minnesota. Is it going to pass? Probably not. But it's there. They're trying. And in typical far-right fashion, when it doesn't work or when they're trying to mask their intentions, they'll go, "Oh, it was a joke. We were just proving a point." But you still tried it. And that's a problem. And I think that's something that our elected officials today need to hear now more than ever. You don't do yourselves any favors by submitting to the will of a wannabe dictator, or bending the knee to an imaginary king, or suckling the toes of the world's greatest cult leader. You were elected by the American people in the hopes that our lives would be better through your service. And the idea that some of these elected officials have the audacity, the nerve, to make up a fake mental illness, use it to undermine our freedom of speech in the promotion of authoritarianism, is baffling. It's the definition of selling out. But that's just how it goes, I suppose. Our Republican representatives are just puppets on strings being played by Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and they don't actually care about the American people. I guess you could say that about any politician, whether they're Republican or Democrat. I think what makes it stand out in this particular situation is you can really see the strings. And there's a lot of people who are insisting that there aren't any strings there.